When I look to reviewers for opinions, I try to find a reviewer whose tastes are similar to my own. That way I can know that if they enjoyed something, the odds are I'm probably going to enjoy it too. With that in mind, I thought that it would be important for me to release a video early on talking about my favorite stories in various mediums. I'll talk about my favorite stories in video games, TV shows, movies, and of course, books. This is just my list of favorites right now. By the time this video is finished filming, I probably have different tastes. Additionally, trying to pick a top 3 in each of these categories was next to impossible, so I just picked the 3 that I think best represent my taste. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually my number 1 or my number 2. Although I will say the video game category is the exemption to this. My video game top 3 is definitive. I'm thinking I might do one of these each year, or maybe every 6 months, depending on how many stories I've experienced between the videos. That said, let's get started. We'll dive in first to my top 3 books. Number 3 is a book that might surprise some people to see is on my list, but it is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. This is a book that I read from a very young age and that left an impact on me after my first read, and I think I've read it through probably 3 or 4 times by now. The zero-gravity fight scenes in this book alone are enough to put it somewhere in my top 10, and I think it always will have a spot in my top 10. But the reason that it's number 3 is because it left such an impact on me due to the way that it approaches things like war. Ender's Game is an easy to get into, very quick read that I recommend to anybody who's looking to get into science fiction. My second pick was a toss-up between 2 different Brandon Sanderson books. And by the way, I'm trying not to pick books by the same author for my top 3, just so that I can get a little more variety in there. Otherwise, all 3 of them would be Terry Pratchett books. So I wanted to pick Oathbringer for my number 1, but I think that I like The Final Empire more. It is the first book in the Mistborn Era 1 trilogy. I enjoy this one because it is a really good standalone novel. Even though it's part of a trilogy, you can read The Final Empire and get a complete story. This is the first book by Brandon Sanderson that I ever read, and that might be playing a part into why it is my number 2 over Oathbringer, although Oathbringer was very close. It was actually originally on this list, and then I decided at the last minute I should just say Final Empire. There's a lot that I could say about the Final Empire and just about the Mistborn trilogy in general. I'd have to really reread it in order to give something in depth, but I will just say the magic system in this book is remarkable and unique. It is probably still my favorite magic system, though I would have to really think about it to be sure, so don't quote me on that. But I love the magic system in this book. I love the characters, the story, all of it is fantastic, and you can read just The Final Empire and get a whole complete story. So this is my number 2 favorite book. So my number 1 book, that's going to be all of Discworld. But since I decided to choose 1 book for each of these, and I don't want it to be the same author for all 3, I'm going to pick 1 Discworld book, and that will be Reaper Man. Now, it has been a while since I've read through the entire Discworld collection, so I might have to do that again, and my favorite might change. But right now I'm going to stick with Reaper Man because this is what I remember being my favorite of the collection from a few years ago when I first read it. Death is probably my favorite character in all of fantasy, but at least my favorite character in Discworld. Terry Pratchett humanized Death to an unprecedented degree. If you only have a chance to read 1 Discworld book, or you're only going to give one of them a chance, get one of the books in the Death collection. The reason I'm picking Reaper Man as my favorite is because the premise of it is so hilariously absurd. We see Death go on leave from his job and take up work as a farmer. He assumes the name Bill Dorr, as in Bill and then Dorr. If the idea of Death taking a leave of absence so he can assume the name Bill Dorr and go work on a farm isn't enough to make you want to read this book, I'm really not sure what it's going to take. So Reaper Man is my favorite. All of Discworld really, but Reaper Man in particular. So those were my favorite books. Let's move on to my favorite movies. It's honestly kind of tempting for me to just list 3 Edgar Wright movies, but just as was the case with Terry Pratchett last time, I'm going to limit myself to 1. Spoiler for what my number 1 movie is going to be. Number 3 is Mr. Nobody. I don't want to sound like I'm some pretentious guy who just enjoys lesser known movies. I'm not. I honestly don't even remember how I happened across this movie or how it came to my attention. I just remember watching it one day several years ago and I fell in love with it. It stars Jared Leto. Hey Google, how do you pronounce Jared Leto?
That's pronounced Jared Leto.
I don't think that's right. It stars Jared Leto, even if Google is saying that his name is Jared Leto. I'm pretty sure it's Leto. Anyway, in the movie, Jared Leto's character is recounting his life to an interviewer. However, his recounting of his life is getting mixed up and seems to be branching off in different directions and recounting several different possibilities. The overall story is really emotional and sad and never fails to bring at least one tear to my eye, although the first time it brought several more. This is a really beautiful story and I really enjoy it. So Mr. Nobody, at least my number 3, it might even be able to swap places with my number 2, which is Christopher Nolan's The Prestige. The Prestige is a Christopher Nolan movie that stars Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale. It follows 2 competing magicians who are constantly trying to outdo each other, but it is a lot more interesting and intense and suspenseful and thrilling than that simple one-line premise makes it sound. There's all sorts of family drama that occurs, there is violence, it is intense, and things just continue to escalate and get more intense throughout the movie. And the reveals here, especially the reveals at the end, are just remarkable. It is everything that you would expect from a really good Christopher Nolan movie, and in my opinion, it is by far his best one. It even raises some grueling questions at the end that make me squirm if I think about them for too long. And number 1, it is really hard for me to choose a favorite Edgar Wright movie. He is by far my favorite director, but the one that I'm picking for this is Baby Driver. This movie is so good that it's still my number 1 despite the presence of a particular cast member, although there is a scene in the movie later on that makes his presence way more bearable. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. The casting of this movie is comprised of a bunch of really interesting choices that work really well. We have Jamie Foxx and Ansel Elgort, Jon Hamm, Elsa Gonzalez, Lily James, Jon Bernthal. Altogether, it is a really interesting cast that I never would have thought to put in this movie, and yet they all work really well and are perfect for their parts. Except for the one that I mentioned earlier. He's only perfect in one scene. Everything about Baby Driver is a cinematic masterpiece. The music is on time through the entire thing. It is beautiful and wonderful. I love this movie. I will never get tired of watching it. At least I haven't so far, and I've watched it quite a few times. So, with favorite movies out of the way, let's move on to my favorite games. This list has actually stayed consistent over the years. It changes very rarely. In fact, this spring was the first time it had changed in several years. Let's go through and we'll see what took the number 1 spot. Number 3, I didn't enjoy the first Witcher game. I thought the second one was alright, but the third game was incredible. I think I have a couple thousand hours in it now. Not certain, I'd have to check, but I have spent a lot of time playing The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. This game delivered way more than it ever promised. It was amazing, and I still enjoy it playing all the way through. I think I've beaten it on every difficulty at least once, some of them a few times. I've played Death March probably 2 or 3 times, I think, and I would recommend it to anyone who enjoys a good RPG video game. Now, Dark Souls 3 held 3rd place on my list for quite some time. It wasn't pushed back until I played that game this spring that took my number 1 spot. So just bear in mind, I do love the Dark Souls series. It's just Dark Souls happened to be pushed back to 4th place. My second favorite game is The Last of Us. The Last of Us uses video games as a storytelling medium better than any other game that I've played. It has been my number 1 favorite game since I first played it when it came out. It wasn't unseated until this year. If you haven't had a chance to play The Last of Us and you like heartfelt, compelling stories, even if you're not a fan of zombies or horror, I strongly recommend sitting down and playing this game. You can play it on its story mode, where the gameplay itself is really easy if you just want to experience the story. Although if you're a gamer who enjoys a challenge, I really enjoyed the grounded mode on this, where you lose a bunch of the abilities that make the game a little more accessible. Things like your hearing senses go away. It makes the game really intense. I enjoyed that experience. But if you want a story, you don't have to play that way. There's a really easy mode if you just want to get through and experience the story. Overall, the story in The Last of Us is unlike any other game that I've played. It broke my heart. It was the first game I played that really made me cry. So, number 1, which game did I finish this year that finally unseated The Last of Us from the number 1 spot it had held for so long? That's going to be Ghost of Tsushima. It kicked The Last of Us, which had held its spot for 8 freaking years, down to number 2, which I never thought that I was going to see a game do. But Ghost of Tsushima absolutely stunned me. They did things that I did not expect, and I tend to kind of see things coming. I don't want to spoil anything, but the way that they subvert your expectations in that game, based on other games that you've played, especially in the open world genre, just They did some things there that were really shocking. It was amazing. I really enjoyed my experience playing Ghost of Tsushima, and I told a bunch of people, friends and family members, that they have to play this game. I love the challenge. It absolutely deserves that #1 spot, and I can't wait to see if something manages to unseat it in another 8 years, or less. Enough about video games, onto my favorite shows. Do you want to hear something really weird? Number 3 was a toss-up between 3 different shows, Adventure Time, Luther, and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I wound up picking It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Always Sunny manages to follow an awful cast of characters without them being unbearable, at least to me. I really like how terrible the characters are, and this is really hard to pull off. Most often, when your cast is just horrible, whatever story it is pretty much unbearable to experience. This isn't the case for Always Sunny. Again, that's my opinion, but I enjoy watching these horrible people do horrible things or have horrible things done to them in particular. It's hilarious. They managed to make it really funny. I really like Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Number 2, when I first heard the premise of this show, I wasn't all that enthused by it or very interested, and that's a shame. I wish I'd started watching it a lot sooner than I did. That show is going to be Breaking Bad. The writing, the acting, the cinematography, everything in this show comes together for an amazing and gut-wrenching, tense, suspenseful show. It is thrilling and dramatic and a show that I still talk about. Just last night, I was discussing some of the nuances of the show with my friends, and it's been several years since Breaking Bad ended. Several moments of the show had me on the edge of my seat the first time I watched them. I kind of wish I could go back to that first time experience where I actually genuinely did not know what was going to happen next. One in particular that I can think of, and again, no spoilers on this channel, so I'm just going to say the train scene. That scene had me so nervous the first time that I watched it. And that feeling, being able to get me to that point, that's absolutely why this deserves to be at least my number 2. So that will bring us to what topped my list of favorite shows. Number 1 is Travelers. This might surprise some people. In fact, I'm willing to bet there's quite a few people who haven't actually watched this show yet. This is an amazing time travel sci-fi show. It was created by Brad Wright. It is beautiful, wonderful, emotional. There are scenes in it that still make me cry and that I imagine will make anybody who has a heart cry. Now, it did have an ending, but I will warn you that the ending was the result of it being canceled. So the show ends. It's just sad that it had to. And I would really like to see this show come back in some form or fashion. So whoever is in charge of that, if you're watching this, please bring Travelers back. Please. So there you have it, my favorite books, games, TV shows, and movies. I hope this list has given you some insight into what my personal preferences and tastes are, as well as maybe given you some ideas for stories you can go and check out. I enjoy a broad, sweeping range of different story types, dramas, comedies, thrillers, some horrors, though not very many. It takes a very specific kind of horror for me to like it, but I have a broad spectrum of taste when it comes to stories. As long as it's a good story, as I've said from my first video, I'm probably going to enjoy it. So, what did you think of my list? Have you watched, played, or read anything on this list? Do you agree with my placement of some of these things? Do you agree with the entirety of my list, meaning that you and I are on the very same wavelength and you should trust every single story recommendation that I give to you from now on? Or do you disagree with some of the ones that I listed here? And if so, why? What would you put in place of them? Do you have anything that you would recommend that I check out based on the list that I provided? I would love to hear your thoughts, especially if you check out something from this list because of my recommendation. I'd love to hear what you think of it. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please feel free to leave your thoughts, criticisms, constructive or otherwise, whatever you want to say. Go ahead. I can probably take it. Bye.